Well, welcome everybody to Richmond upon Thames. My name is Nicholas, and today I'll be taking you around one of the most picturesque towns to visit within Greater London. A while away, a few hours by the river. It's home to one of Europe's largest walled parks and spectacular views of the city. Once home to royalty and now home to rock stars. The riverside here is almost European in nature and only 20 minutes from London. But the history of this town goes back more than 1,000 years. It was home to medieval monarchs, and during the Tudor dynasty was home to one of the most important palaces in the land that gave the town its name. Now the palace no longer exists after a couple of fires and an annoying civil war, but we can still visit some remnants of the old building. And today I'll be taking you through the town, up to Richmond Hill, before returning to the riverside to continue our journey upstream. So let's get going. So now standing next to the oldest surviving bridge in London. This is Richmond Bridge, and it was built in 1777, and when it was built it was the 8th bridge in Greater London. The very first, of course, was a London Bridge from the popular nursery rhyme, but this one is absolutely beautiful, a great example of Georgian architecture. And just under those arches there you can see a line where they had to expand the bridge. It was of course a bit too thin for modern traffic and horse and cart, of course, when it was expanded in the 1830s. Absolutely fantastic. So let's continue on our way up the river. So we're just walking along the riverside, which is to your right and my left, and to my right here would have once been part of the old palace that was built in the medieval period and lasted up to the Tudor times. Now lots of private houses and some very nice gardens behind there. But this town of Richmond was originally called Sheen. That was a name that dates back to the middle of the 10th century and has Saxon origin. It lay on the meandering River Thames and was about halfway to Windsor from London, and the hill that stretched up from the river here all the way to the top was perfect for visibility, for hunting, an advantage point where both Windsor and London could have been seen. It was a perfect location for a retreat around here, not too close to London but not too far away either, an hour's horse ride away. But in the 1100s, everything changed when Henry I, the son of William the Conqueror, established Sheen as an independent manor. It was gifted to a Norman knight, and its association with royalty had begun and was to last for the next 500 years. It was Henry I's great grandson, Edward III, who built the first palace here in the 15th century. It had a small moat, which we're actually probably walking on right now, and would have looked a little bit more like a castle. Well, he became the first king to die at Sheen Palace, as it was known, in 1377, but it was his grandson, Richard II, who made the palace a permanent residence for himself and his wife. Henry V had a go at rebuilding it in 1414, but died in France before he could complete it. But the change from Sheen to Richmond came at the beginning of the Tudor period, when Henry VII made Richmond his preferred countryside retreat from London. He held a huge tournament here, recorded in the history books, in 1492, with jousting and archery, and took quite a liking to the palace. His daughter, Margaret Beaufort, married James IV of Scotland here, thus beginning the Stuart dynasty. But it all nearly ended in disaster in 1497. A fire destroyed the old palace at Christmas time, and all the wooden buildings that it was made of went up like kindling, and the king barely made it out alive. One of the hallways nearly collapsed on his head. He and his children had to make a quick exit, and one of them was the young Henry VIII. But the palace was rebuilt from the ashes, better than before, in brick and stone, using some of the finest decorations in the land. The palace was adorned with gifts from bankers in Venice, cloth woven with gold, and all the trappings of royalty. Upon its completion in 1501, it was renamed Richmond Palace, after Henry's ancestral lands in the north of England. He became next king to die in the palace in 1509, and Henry VIII actually lived here for a while until he got a bit outdated and he set his sights on Hampton Court further upstream. But the palace then became known as the Queen's Palace. He gave it to Anne Boleyn when he was courting her, and later, when she fell out of favour, it fell into the hands of his daughter Mary, who was later to become Mary I of England. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died at this palace 10 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. And Anne of Cleves, another wife, was also given to it, so it seems to be passed around quite a bit. But the palace really reached its zenith during the Elizabethan period. Pardon me. Queen Elizabeth, the last Tudor, loved Richmond Palace, and whenever the Queen was, so were the courtiers and the confidants, the wealth, the pomp and the ceremony. And the town grew rapidly, as did the inner city of London. The soot, the smoke and the plagues of various proportions pushed the wealthy out to these retreats on the outskirts of London. And it was on the river. Why not? You can take the boat with the tide. Up and down. It was safe, economical and a fast way of transportation. And this was the age of exploration, exotic plants and creatures from faraway lands, a time of fashion and frivolity, of poets and pirates, and Shakespeare would have visited Richmond to perform his plays. Elizabeth I loved the palace. She spent huge amounts of time here and was the next monarch to die in Richmond in 1603. And the palace is sadly no longer here. It was destroyed in the Civil War, although some parts of the original structure still remain, and over the walls would have made up on the palace's grounds. Just behind me here now is a beautiful building from the 18th century called Asgill House, built for a man called Charles Asgill in the 1760s. He was a really successful banker and a merchant mayor of London, but it's a Palladian style here, and you can tell he was showing off a bit. The building is made with Bath stone, and the further away your materials came from, the wealthier you were. It's a bit similar today. If you can afford marble from Italy in your buildings, then you're doing pretty well. But anyway, it's right by the river. Now the tide's up today, but when it's low down, 2 times a year, you can see the old medieval crane that was put here by Edward III, and this would have originally been the area of the brew house of the palace, and more or less where this house was would have been one of these huge turrets. We're going to take a walk down Old Palace Lane, just down here, and go and have a look at some of the old remains of Richmond Palace. So the street behind me, the river's at the very end where we were earlier, is called Old Palace Lane. These are beautiful cottages over here, built in the 1700s for the local artisans, the boat builders, the sort of workers of the area. And they'd have all drunk in the pub right at the end called the White Swan, which was also built in the 1700s. It's quite funny, these houses go for millions now. They're very, very desirable. And right at the end here is where French aristocracy would have lived during the Revolution in France. They were probably moved into one of these buildings, and they say that when Shakespeare visited Queen Elizabeth in her palace here in the Tudor period, he would have performed his plays here. But it's a lovely little old street, and we're going to walk a little bit further up and take a look at the old gatehouse, the only part surviving from the palace. So just behind me is Richmond Green. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you might have seen a couple of these already. They're a quintessential part of our English towns and villages. This is where you go to walk your dog, to chat with your neighbours, maybe have a game of frisbee or even cricket in the summertime. The first recorded game of cricket on this green was in 1666, the same year as the Great Fire of London. And this has been much, much older. This would have been where Henry VIII would have had his jousting tournaments. They practiced archery here for hundreds of years, and where Henry VII had his great tournament in 1492. But this small little concrete road here, this path by the red post box, is probably much older than you think, because right in front of it is the entrance to Richmond Palace. This is the last part left of what was once a massive palace that led right down to the river where we were earlier. Now, there was a civil war in the 17th century. King Charles I fought against Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentarians, and he lost. A lot of the land was sold off to the highest bidder to pay for those costs, and Richmond Palace was no exception. It was sadly dismantled and taken down, and all that's left now is this gatehouse. However, upon the return of the monarchy, Charles II, the house was returned to the monarchs, and you can see a little sign there. It still belongs to the crown. But anyway, from here, let's go up to the top of the hill and have a look at one of the most famous views in London. So before we make our way up the hill to have a look at the view, check out that river behind me. This really is one of the best places to come and rent a rowing boat, a canoe or paddleboard, and take a couple of hours going down this beautiful calm river. Nothing like the Thames in London, which is no way should you jump in that. You can row all the way to Twickenham if you choose, and go to a local pub and then come back with the tide. It's a fantastic half day out. Get up the top of that hill, shall we? So let's take a walk up the hill from the river. We're going through Terrace Gardens in Richmond, which, believe it or not, was once a brickworks. all the way back in the 1700s and is now a beautiful garden overlooking the river. It has an ice house, which before electricity would have been where you kept your ice for your drinks, and a greenhouse which dates from the 1770s, although it's been rebuilt several times since. Well, we've made it up to the top of the hill, quite a little bit of a walk, but there's the river down there meandering its way onwards to Twickenham. And you can see it's beautiful, it's green as far as the eye can see. Not much of this view has changed for the best part of 300 years, and it's one of the few views in the United Kingdom that's protected by specific Act of Parliament. You're not allowed to build anything in this viewpoint that kind of ruins it, and it's been painted by countless artists. J.M.W. Turner, Constable, Joshua Reynolds, who coincidentally lived just over there for quite a lot of the time, and you can see why they loved it so much. This green space here that we're walking on is common land, and sometimes you'll see cattle being grazed here. The common land goes all the way back to the medieval period. It was rights of the peasants and the common people to farm their animals and have space to collect firewood, these sorts of things. And behind us here, these beautiful houses, what a view if you own one of these buildings, is where we have our modern royalty, rock stars such as Mick Jagger, Pete Townsend, Ronnie Woods once lived here, and a few more. I'm not going to say where they live, you'll have to do that research yourself. But anyway, up the stairs we go. But beautiful part of London to come and take a bit of time out in. And it's from this view, on a clear day, you can see all the way to Windsor Castle. Now the quality of this camera is not good enough to point that out, but if you do come here, there's a little sign just down there and a small telescope when you can catch it. You can see Heathrow Airport, Twickenham Rugby Stadium, as far as the eye can see. This is Richmond Hill. There's a beautiful little pub over here to quench your thirst called the Roebuck, just over there. There's great pub lunches and a nice cold pint. They'll come and collect the glasses, so it's not a problem if you sit here on the terrace and catch that view for one of the most spectacular sunsets in the country. So just next to that view we have one of the most fantastic parks in Europe, in my belief in the world. We're standing in Richmond Park. It's one of the largest walled parks in Europe, created by Charles I, 1625, and in 1637 he put a wall around it which angered the locals, but it was to stop all the poachers from bagging those tasty deer. Eventually he gave them rights of way which continue to this very day, and the deer just behind me here share the park with the joggers and the cyclists who use this park quite a lot. I'm not sure if you can see, but all the way in the background on a clear day you can see right into London, the London Eye and the Shard, only 10 miles away. But Richmond Park is a different video altogether, and I'll be covering that in another YouTube video of sorts. But for now, it's back to the river we go and along towards Twickenham. Thank you for watching, everybody. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Have a great summer. Bye bye, everyone.